Hey y'all, today we're going to start a new unit on crime scene investigation and evidence collection. So for part one of these notes, you're going to need your CSI PDF note-taking guide. You can fill that in kind of as you go throughout the day. So this is your video walkthrough of some of the notes for today. So first of all, what is crime scene investigation? It's the use of physical evidence at the scene of the crime, and combined with deductive and inductive reasoning, we are able to gain knowledge of the events surrounding the crime. So in order to get the right offender, we need to have evidence to prove that that person committed the crime. So not only do we need evidence, but we also need to, as forensic scientists, work with police, work with detectives, work with medical examiners sometimes to figure out what happened. If we kind of know a timeline of events, we're more likely to figure out how the evidence relates to those events and eventually, solve the crime in the end. Okay. So a crime scene investigator is not the same thing as a forensic scientist. A forensic scientist works in a lab. A crime scene investigator is the person who physically goes to the crime scene and properly collects and packages, labels, and documents all of the evidence, takes notes, makes sketches, takes photos, all of those things to document how the scene was when they got there. So a crime scene investigator is responsible for 5 of the following aspects of evidence. Number 1, collection. Number 2, preservation. Number 3, packaging. Number 4, transportation of evidence from the scene to wherever it goes next. And number 5, documenting everything that was collected, and what time and who collected it. And that's called chain of custody, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So in forensics, we have 2 types of evidence. One is testimonial evidence, and the other is physical evidence. So the whole point of evidence is that we want to prove something that's in question. For example, does this DNA belong to Shudik or does it not? We can prove one way or the other conclusively, and that's what we try to do with all evidence that we collect. So testimonial evidence comes from oral or written or video statements. So it can come from people like victims, witnesses, or suspects. And then any kind of video surveillance, whether that's from a security camera or a cell phone recording or a traffic camera, all of that's considered testimonial evidence. Physical evidence is a material object through which a crime is committed. So these can be physical objects that you can pick up, or microscopic type evidence like DNA, sometimes blood, hairs, and fibers, called trace evidence that we will again get into later. Okay, so those are our 2 types of evidence. For every single piece of evidence that we collect at a crime scene, we need to ask 3 questions. So if we collect 100 pieces of evidence, we have to ask these 3 questions about each of those 100 pieces. That's 300 questions. So a crime scene investigator has a really, really big job, and it's super important to work closely with the scientist and the detective and whoever else is investigating to answer these questions so that we can put that timeline of events together, make the evidence, see if it fits or not, and then continue on in our case. So number 1, what is this evidence and what is its function at the scene? So let's say we walk up to a crime scene where there has been a homicide, someone has been shot, okay? So let's say we find a gun at the scene. So question number 1, what is it? It's a gun. And what is its function at the scene? What is it doing there? Does it make sense for a gun to be at a scene where a victim has been shot? In this case, it does. Okay, if we found a gun at the scene of a stabbing, that's a different story. That wouldn't make sense. Question number 2, what is the relationship between the gun and other pieces of evidence. So what are the other pieces of evidence we find at the scene? Is the gun related to those other pieces of evidence, or does it seem out of place? That's something to consider. Number 3, what information does this gun give us about timing and sequencing? So in this homicide, our victim has been shot. Did the shooting happen early on in the crime? Did it happen in the middle of whatever bigger crime may or may not have been committed? Was shooting the end game, the original intent of this offense? That's something that we need to look at. So this timeline of events we're putting together, does it make sense for the gun to go at the beginning, at the end, so on and so forth? We need to know when it possibly would have been used throughout the course of this crime. Okay? So a good piece of evidence is going to connect 3 things. It's going to connect the scene, the suspect, and the victim all together. Okay? So, scenario B. Let's say that somebody gets murdered in my classroom. Okay? My fingerprints are all over my classroom. Does that mean that I killed anyone because my fingerprints are all over my classroom? No. Does it place me at the scene at some point in the past? Yes. Okay, now let's say that my fingerprints are found at the scene and they're also found on some of the victim's personal possessions. That would place me, the suspect, at the scene, and it would put me in contact with the victim as well. Now that still doesn't mean that I murdered anyone, but it does make more than one connection because it connects all 3 of those points, all 3 of those elements. That is a solid piece of evidence, and that's a piece of evidence that they would take to court. Okay? All right, so very important. The last thing we need to remember today is that a crime scene investigator's job primarily is to preserve the integrity of every crime scene that you go to. So what that means is that we need to document what the scene looks like when we get there. So before we start collecting evidence, during the evidence collection process, and before we leave, after we put down the markers, after we clean up everything has to be documented. So at the end of all things, there's going to be like a 40-page report detailing what you did from start to finish. All the things, okay? So contamination is super important, especially in West Texas where it's really, really windy. So if you have an outdoor crime scene, it's super important to notice how things are when you get there, because contamination happens all the time, whether that's by weather, like wind can blow away evidence, or whether that's by a person. So 3 things you should never do at a crime scene is add anything, destroy anything, or move anything. Okay, if you add something to the scene, let's say that I'm not super careful and I leave my footprints at a crime scene. That now places me, if they can track those footprints to me, that places me at the scene of a crime that I had nothing to do with. And if it's not documented that my footprints were there before or after I arrived, how do they know that I wasn't a part of the crime? Okay, you shouldn't destroy any material. That one's pretty common sense. And you shouldn't ever move anything. So here's a thing I would totally have to be careful of. I am a big coffee person. Some of you know this. So let's say I arrive at the scene. It's 3 a.m, I'm on call, and the first thing I do is I make coffee. Okay, I can take my coffee to the scene, but I need to leave it outside the crime scene tape, because my coffee, because I've been drinking it, also contains my DNA. So if I bring that material into or under the crime scene tape into the scene, that then places my DNA at the scene. And if I don't document that my cup was brought in after the crime occurred, again, that places me at the scene, and I can potentially now be a suspect. So all of this is really, really important. if you haven't remembered any of the information today yet, I need you to remember this. Okay, this is the whole foundation of forensic science, and it's called Locard's exchange principle. So the scientist Edmund Locard did some research, and he discovered, or logically reasoned, that when two objects come into contact with one another, there is a physical transfer or exchange of materials between those two objects, no matter what they are. Okay? And this is why evidence is a thing. This is why we can collect it, because we know that when things touch, they leave traces of each other behind, okay? So if I'm using my phone, I'm touching my phone, what am I leaving on this? You can probably see it in the camera because it's real dirty. My fingerprints are all over this phone. That's the evidence I'm leaving behind. Now, what is the phone giving back to me when I touch it? Probably all of the germs and oils from the entire day that have been on my phone are now on my thumb and my fingers. Okay? So no matter what these two objects are, they're always exchanging something. And science is so advanced at this point that forensic scientists can now go in and find the smallest pieces of evidence, like microscopic pieces of evidence, and then use that tiny, tiny material to prove something major in a courtroom, whether that's guilt or whether that's innocence. So Locard's exchange principle, super important that you know that definition. It's going to pop up over and over and over. Wink, wink, hint, hint. Know it for your next test. Okay? So take all of that in. Make sure that you filled out your PDF note-taking guide up until this point. And then here in a minute, we're going to talk about crime scene photography.